The morning started like any other day in the Crystal Palace where Empress Valeria ruled over the last remaining elves in the realm, and she woke up to the sound of her 3 dragons chirping for their breakfast in the nesting chamber below her. Bedroom Valeria stretched her arms above her head, and her silver hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall of moonlight, and she smiled because today was supposed to be peaceful, with no meetings or ceremonies to attend, and she could spend the entire day with her beloved dragons. She walked down the spiral staircase that was carved from pure white stone and decorated with glowing blue crystals that lit up when she passed by them, and the palace had been her home for over 200 years, since she became Empress after her mother passed away. The nesting chamber was warm and filled with soft golden light from the magical torches on the walls, and her 3 dragons waited for her with excitement in their bright orange eyes, and their scales shimmered like precious gems in the morning glow. There was Thunder, who was the oldest and largest, with deep red scales that looked like rubies, and he was strong and brave and always protected his younger siblings from any danger that came near them. Then there was Storm, who had blue scales like sapphires, and she was clever and quick and loved to play tricks on everyone in the palace by hiding their things and watching them search everywhere with confusion on their faces. And finally, there was little Ember, who was the youngest and smallest, with golden scales that sparkled like sunshine. And he was gentle and curious and always wanted to explore new places, even though Valeria told him to stay close to home. Valeria fed them their breakfast, which was a mix of special herbs and magical fruits that helped dragons grow strong and healthy, and she petted each one while they ate and told them how much she loved them. After breakfast, Thunder and Storm flew off to the training grounds, where the elf warriors practiced their combat skills and the dragons liked to watch them and sometimes join in the exercises. But Ember stayed behind because he was still too young for such rough activities. Valeria decided to take Ember for a walk in the royal gardens where flowers bloomed in every color imaginable, and the air smelled sweet like honey and cinnamon mixed together, and butterflies danced around them like tiny pieces of rainbow. They spent the morning playing hide-and-seek among the tall hedges, and Ember was very good at hiding, because his small size let him squeeze into places that Valeria could never fit, and she pretended not to see him, even when his tail stuck out from behind a bush. But then everything changed when a messenger arrived at the garden gates with panic written all over his face, and he bowed quickly before telling Valeria that smoke had been spotted rising from the northern forest, and it was not normal smoke but purple and thick, and it smelled like death. Valeria felt her heart sink into her stomach, because she knew what purple smoke meant, and it was the sign of the shadow cult who practiced dark magic and destroyed everything they touched, and they had been quiet for many years. But now, they were back. She told the messenger to gather all the warriors and prepare for battle, and she needed to go investigate the smoke herself, because she was the most powerful magic user in the realm, and only she could fight against the dark spells of the shadow cult. Valeria turned to Ember and told him to fly back to the nesting chamber and wait there with his siblings until she returned. But the little dragon did not want to leave her side, and he made sad chirping sounds that broke her heart. She knelt down and hugged him close and promised that she would be back before sunset, and he should be brave and protect the palace while she was gone. And Ember finally agreed, even though he still looked worried. Valeria called Thunder and Storm to her side, and the 3 of them flew toward the northern forest, where the purple smoke grew thicker with each passing moment, and the sky above them turned dark, like nighttime, even though it was still morning. When they reached the forest, Valeria saw that the trees were burning with purple flames that did not behave like normal fire, and instead of spreading outward, they seemed to be moving inward toward the center of the forest, like they were searching for something specific. Landed on the ground and told Thunder and Storm to circle above and watch for any enemies, while she went deeper into the burning woods to find the source of this dark magic and stop it before it spread to the villages nearby. The heat was intense, and sweat dripped down her face as she walked through the smoke, and her eyes watered from the poisonous fumes that filled the air, and she had to use her magic to create a protective bubble around herself just to breathe. Valeria followed the flames toward their center, and along the way she saw dead animals lying on the ground, and the plants had turned black and withered away, and she felt anger rising inside her chest because the shadow cult had no respect for life. Then she heard something that made her blood freeze in her veins, and it was the sound of a baby dragon crying out in fear and pain. and she recognized that voice immediately, because it belonged to Ember. Her mind raced with confusion, because she had left Ember back at the palace and told him to stay in the nesting chamber, but somehow he had followed her into the forest, and now he was trapped somewhere in this burning nightmare. Valeria ran faster than she had ever run before, and she called out his name with both her voice and her mind, trying to reach him through their magical bond. But the dark magic blocked her connection like a thick wall of ice. The crying grew louder and more desperate, and Valeria pushed through the flames even though they burned her. Skin and her lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, and nothing mattered except finding Ember. Before it was too late, she burst into a clearing where the purple fire burned brightest, and the heat was so intense that her protective bubble started to crack, and she looked around frantically, searching for any sign of her precious dragon. And then she saw something that made her stop in her tracks, and her mind could not understand what her eyes were showing her, because there in the middle of the clearing stood a human woman, and she was holding Ember in her arms. Valeria stood frozen at the edge of the clearing and stared at the impossible sight before her eyes, because humans were not supposed to be in these forests. And they definitely were not supposed to be holding her dragon like he was something precious. The woman had dark brown skin that glistened with sweat from the intense heat, and her black hair was cut short in a style that Valeria had never seen before, and she wore strange clothing that looked nothing like the simple tunics and robes that village humans typically wore. What shocked Valeria most was the way the woman held Ember close to her chest with both arms wrapped protectively around him, and her body was positioned like a shield between the little dragon and the purple flames that raged. All around them, Ember was making soft whimpering sounds, and his golden scales were covered in ash and soot. But he seemed unharmed, and he had stopped crying, now that he was being held by this mysterious stranger. The human woman looked up, and her eyes met Valeria's, and there was no fear in those brown eyes, only determination and exhaustion, and something else that the Empress could not quite identify. But it felt warm and genuine. Valeria took a step forward and raised her hand, ready to use magic to grab Ember away from this human, because she did not know if the woman was friend or enemy, and she could not take any chances with her dragon's safety. But the woman did not make any threatening moves, and instead, she spoke in a language that sounded familiar but also strange at the same time, and Valeria had to concentrate hard to understand the words because they were spoken with an unusual accent. The woman said something about finding the little one trapped under a fallen tree, and the fire was getting closer, so she pulled him out and ran, but now she did not know which way to go, because the smoke was too thick to see anything. Valeria felt her anger melting away and being replaced with confusion and curiosity, because this human had saved Ember's life when she could have just run away and left him there to die in the cursed flames. She lowered her hand and spoke back in the old human tongue that her grandmother had taught her many years ago, when the two races still lived in peace before the great war that tore them apart forever. Valeria asked the woman who she was and why she was in these forbidden woods where humans never dared to enter, and more importantly, why she had risked her own life to save a dragon that most humans would have killed on sight. The woman seemed surprised that Valeria could speak her language, and she introduced herself as Maya, and explained that she was not from this land but from a place called Earth, and she had arrived here 3 days ago through something she called a portal. Maya said she was a doctor back home, and her people were exploring different worlds through these portals, trying to learn about other civilizations and make peaceful contact. But she got separated from her team during an accident. She had been wandering through the forest trying to find her way back to the portal site when she heard the baby dragon crying, and her instincts as a healer kicked in, and she could not just leave a helpless creature to die alone in the fire. Valeria listened to this explanation, and her mind was spinning with all this new information, because portals and other worlds were things from ancient legends, and she never thought they could be real. But here was living proof standing right in front of her. She looked at Maya more carefully and noticed the burns covering her hands and arms where the purple flames had touched her skin, and there were cuts on her legs from running through the thorny underbrush, and her breathing was labored from inhaling too much smoke. The Empress made a decision, and she stepped forward with her arms outstretched, and Maya hesitated for only a moment before gently placing Ember into Valeria's waiting embrace, and the little dragon immediately nuzzled against her neck, making happy chirping sounds. Valeria held Ember close and checked him over for injuries, and she was relieved to find that he was mostly fine, except for being scared and tired, and she whispered soothing words in the ancient dragon language that only she knew. Then she turned her attention back to Maya, who was now swaying on her feet, and looked like she might collapse at any moment from exhaustion and pain. And Valeria knew she needed to help this human who had saved her most precious treasure. She reached out and placed her hand on Maya's burned arm and closed her eyes and channeled her healing magic into the human's body, and a soft green light glowed between them, and Maya gasped as the pain disappeared. The burns faded away and new healthy skin grew in their place, and the cuts on her legs sealed themselves shut, and Maya stared at her arms in complete wonder like she had just witnessed a miracle. Valeria explained that she was the last Empress of the High Elves, and she had the power to heal and protect, and she owed Maya a debt that could never be fully repaid, because Ember was not just a pet. But family Maya seemed overwhelmed by everything that was happening, and she asked if this was all real, or if she had passed out in the smoke and was having a very vivid dream right now. The Empress smiled for the first time since this nightmare began, and she assured Maya that everything was real, and now they needed to get out of this cursed forest before the Shadow Cult sent more dark magic their way. She told Maya to climb onto Thunder's back, who had landed nearby when he saw that Valeria had found Ember, and the human looked terrified at the idea of riding a dragon. But she agreed because staying in the burning forest was clearly more dangerous. Valeria mounted Storm while holding Ember securely in her arms, and she gave the command, and all 3 dragons launched into the sky and flew away from the purple flames toward the safety of the Crystal Palace. During the flight, Maya held onto Thunder's scales with white knuckles, and her eyes were squeezed shut, and she was muttering something in her own language that sounded like a prayer or maybe a counting exercise to stay calm. When they finally landed in the palace courtyard, Maya stumbled off Thunder's back and fell to her knees and kissed the solid ground and said she would never complain about airplane turbulence ever again. Valeria helped her up and guided her into the palace, where servants rushed forward with worried expressions and questions about what had happened and who this strange human was and why she was here. The Empress raised her hand for silence and announced that Maya was their honored guest, and she had saved Prince Ember's life, and anyone who showed her disrespect would answer directly to their Empress. She led Maya to the guest quarters, which had not been used in decades, and the room was beautiful with silk curtains and a bed covered in soft furs and a balcony that overlooked the gardens. Maya collapsed onto the bed and looked up at Valeria with gratitude in her eyes, and she thanked her for the healing and for trusting her enough to bring her here instead of leaving her in the forest. Valeria sat on the edge of the bed and told Maya that she should rest now, and they would talk more tomorrow when she had recovered her strength. And there were many questions that needed answers, but they could wait. As she turned to leave, Maya called out and asked if she could see Ember one more time before sleeping, and Valeria smiled and placed the little dragon on the bed next to her, and Ember immediately curled up against Maya's side. The Empress watched as both the human and the dragon fell asleep within minutes, and she wondered what strange fate had brought them together, and what it would mean for the future of her people. The next morning, Valeria woke early and made her way to the guest quarters to check on Maya, and she found the human woman standing on the balcony watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Maya turned when she heard footsteps, and her face broke into a warm smile, and she thanked Valeria again for her kindness and hospitality, and said she had slept better than she had in days. Despite all the chaos of yesterday, Ember was still curled up on the bed, fast asleep, and his little chest rose and fell with each peaceful breath, and tiny puffs of smoke came from his nostrils, which made both women smile at the adorable sight. Valeria invited Maya to join her for breakfast in the main hall, and the human eagerly agreed, because she admitted she was absolutely starving, and the last real meal she had eaten was 2 days ago before she got lost in the forest. They walked through the palace corridors, and Maya kept stopping to stare at everything with wide eyes, full of wonder, and she asked questions about the glowing crystals and the architecture and the magical paintings that moved on the walls, like living photographs. The main hall was enormous, with high ceilings supported by marble columns and long tables that could seat hundreds of people. But now most of them sat empty because the elf population had dwindled so much over the centuries. Servants brought them plates filled with fresh fruit and warm bread and honey and cheese, and Maya ate like she had not seen food in weeks, and she kept making happy sounds while she chewed, and Valeria found it quite amusing. Between bites, Maya told Valeria more about her world and how humans there had developed technology instead of magic, and they had machines that could fly and communicate across vast distances and cure diseases that would be fatal here. She explained that she worked in a hospital helping sick and injured people get better, and she specialized in emergency medicine, which meant she dealt with the most critical cases where every second mattered. Valeria listened with fascination, because elves had always believed that humans were primitive creatures who lived short, brutal lives in dirty villages. But Maya's descriptions painted a very different picture of human civilization on Earth. Maya showed Valeria something she called a photograph, which was a small flat object that displayed frozen images of her family back home, and Valeria was amazed by this technology that could capture a moment in time so perfectly. There was Maya's mother, who had the same warm smile, and her father, who was tall and wore glasses, and her younger brother, who was training to be an engineer, and they all looked so happy together in the picture. Valeria felt a pang of sadness in her chest because she had no family left and she was the last of the royal bloodline, and when she died there would be no one to take her place as Empress. Maya must have noticed the change in her expression because she reached across the table and gently squeezed Valeria's hand and said that family was not always about blood, and sometimes the people we chose to keep close were just as important. The Empress appreciated those words more than Maya could know, and she found herself wanting to share things with this human that she had never told anyone before about the loneliness of leadership and the weight of being responsible for an entire dying race. But their conversation was interrupted when a guard rushed into the hall and bowed quickly before reporting that scouts had returned from the northern forest with troubling news about the shadow cult's activities. Valeria's expression hardened, and she excused herself and told Maya to wait here, where it was safe, and she would return as soon as she dealt with this matter. But Maya stood up and insisted on coming along. The human said that if this shadow cult was dangerous, then Valeria might need help, and Maya had medical training that could be useful if anyone got injured, and besides, she was tired of sitting around doing nothing. Valeria wanted to refuse, but something in Maya's determined eyes made her reconsider, and she realized that this human had already proven herself brave and capable. By saving Ember, and maybe it would not hurt to have her perspective on things, they went to the war room where the scouts waited along with the captain of the guard, who was an older elf named Kieran, with silver hair and scars covering his arms. From countless battles, Kieran reported that the shadow cult had established a camp deep in the northern forest, and they were performing dark rituals that corrupted the land and killed everything living nearby, and their numbers had grown significantly. Over the past few months, the scouts had counted at least 50 cult members plus various dark creatures they had summoned from the void, and the purple fire from yesterday was just a small test of their power, and they were planning something much worse. Valeria asked what their ultimate goal was, and Kieran's face grew grim as he explained that the cult wanted to open a permanent portal to the Shadow Realm and unleash an army of demons that would consume this world. Maya listened to all this with growing concern, and she asked if the cult knew about the Crystal Palace and if they posed a direct threat to everyone here, and Kieran confirmed that yes, they definitely knew, and an attack was likely coming soon. The Empress stood and walked to the large map on the wall that showed the entire realm, and she studied it carefully while her mind worked through various strategies and possibilities. She could send her warriors to attack the cult camp, but they were outnumbered in the dark. Magic would give the enemy a significant advantage, and she might lose many good soldiers in a battle they could not win. Or she could focus on strengthening the palace defenses and wait for the cult to come to them, but that would give the enemy more time to grow stronger and complete whatever ritual they were planning. Maya spoke up and suggested a third option, which was to gather intelligence first before making any decisions, and she said that back on Earth, military forces never went into battle without proper information about their enemy. Valeria considered this and realized Maya was right, and rushing in blindly would be foolish no matter how urgent the situation felt, and she asked if Maya had any ideas about how to gather this intelligence safely. The human thought for a moment and then proposed using the dragons for aerial reconnaissance, because they could fly high enough to avoid detection and observe the cult camp from above and report back on their exact numbers and activities Kieran objected immediately and said it was too dangerous to risk the dragons, especially young Ember, who was still learning to fly properly, but Maya pointed out that she had not suggested using Ember at all. Thunder and Storm were both experienced and powerful, and if they went at night when visibility was poor, the cult might not even notice them flying overhead, and they could return with valuable information. Valeria saw the wisdom in this plan, and she agreed that it was worth trying, and she would go with Thunder herself while Storm would fly with Kieran as backup, and they would leave after sunset when darkness provided cover. Maya asked if there was anything she could do to help, and Valeria told her she could stay with Ember and keep him company because the little dragon had become quite attached to her, and he would feel safer with her nearby. The human agreed and said she would also start thinking about defensive strategies and medical preparations, in case the cult did attack, and her experience with emergency situations might prove useful. As the meeting ended and everyone dispersed to prepare for the night mission, Valeria found herself impressed by Maya's quick thinking and practical approach to problems that seemed insurmountable. She realized that having this human around was changing her perspective on many things, and maybe the old prejudices between their races were based on misunderstandings that could be overcome with time and effort. That evening, as Valeria prepared Thunder for the reconnaissance flight, she looked over and saw Maya playing with Ember in the courtyard, and the little dragon was doing tricks and showing off while Maya laughed and clapped. Something warm bloomed in Valeria's chest as she watched them, and she thought that perhaps fate had brought Maya here for a reason that went beyond just saving Ember, and maybe this human would help save them all. Night fell over the Crystal Palace like a dark blanket, and Valeria stood in the courtyard with Thunder beside her, while Kieran prepared Storm for their dangerous mission into enemy territory. Maya came out of the palace with Ember perched on her shoulder, and the little dragon chirped nervously because he could sense that something important was about to happen, and he did not like being left behind. Valeria walked over and stroked Ember's head gently and promised him that she would return before morning, and he needed to be brave and protect Maya while she was gone, and the little dragon reluctantly agreed. Maya looked worried, and she made Valeria promise to be careful and not take any unnecessary risks, because the world needed her alive, and the human's concern felt genuine and warm, and made Valeria's heart flutter in an unexpected way. The Empress climbed onto Thunder's back, and Kieran mounted Storm, and with a powerful leap, both dragons launched into the night sky, and their dark shapes quickly disappeared against the backdrop of stars. They flew north toward the Shadow Cult's camp and kept high enough that they would appear as nothing more than birds to anyone watching from the ground, and the cool night air rushed past them carrying the scent of pine and earth. After nearly an hour of flight, Thunder made a low rumbling sound that indicated they were approaching their destination, and Valeria leaned forward to peer down through the darkness at the forest below. What she saw made her blood run cold, because the cult camp was much larger than the scouts had reported, and there were not 50 members, but easily over 200, and they had built crude wooden structures in a clearing that glowed with sickly purple. Light in the center of the camp was a massive circular platform covered in strange symbols that pulsed with dark energy, and robed figures moved around it chanting in a language that hurt Valeria's ears, even from this distance. She signaled to Kieran, and they circled the camp slowly while counting numbers and noting the positions of guards and supplies, and any potential weaknesses they could exploit if they needed to attack. But what shocked Valeria most was when she noticed several humans among the cult members, and they wore the same robes as the others and participated in the dark rituals with the same fervor and dedication. She had always thought the Shadow Cult was purely an organization of corrupted elves who had turned away from the light, but seeing humans involved meant this threat was bigger than she had imagined. Thunder suddenly tensed beneath her and made a warning growl deep in his throat, and Valeria looked down to see a cult member pointing up at them and shouting. To alert the others, dark magic bolts shot up toward them like purple lightning, and Thunder rolled to the side to dodge them, while Storm did the same, and both dragons roared in defiance before turning to flee back toward the palace. More magic bolts chased them through the sky, and some came dangerously close to hitting their targets, and Valeria could feel the dark energy crackling past her skin, leaving trails of cold numbness wherever it touched. Kieran's Storm got hit in the tail by one bolt, and the dragon shrieked in pain but kept flying, and Valeria shouted to him, asking if he was all right, and he yelled back that they would make it, but Storm needed immediate healing. They pushed the dragons to fly faster than ever before, and finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they saw the glowing crystals of the palace rising in the distance. Thunder and Storm landed hard in the courtyard, and both were breathing heavily from exertion, and Storm's tail was smoking where the dark magic had burned through his scales. Leaving a nasty wound, Maya came running out with Ember right behind her, and she immediately assessed Storm's injury with practiced eyes and asked if Valeria could use her healing magic to treat it. The Empress was exhausted from the flight and the fear and the narrow escape, but she knelt beside Storm and placed her hands on his wounded tail and channeled her remaining energy into healing the damage. Green light flowed from her, hands into Storm's body, and the burned scales began to regenerate, and the dragon made grateful rumbling sounds as the pain faded away, and new healthy scales grew to replace the damaged ones. But Valeria had used too much magic, and she swayed dangerously, and would have fallen if Maya had not caught her and supported her weight, while calling for servants to bring water and food. They helped Valeria into the palace, and to her private chambers, where she collapsed onto her bed, and Maya stayed by her side, making sure she was comfortable and safe while she recovered. The human brought her water and made her drink, even though Valeria protested that she was fine, and Maya said that fine people did not almost faint from magical exhaustion, and she needed to rest whether she liked it or not. Valeria found herself smiling despite the serious situation, because Maya's bossy, caring attitude reminded her of her mother who had passed away so long ago, and it felt nice to have someone worry about her welfare. Maya asked what they had seen at the cult camp, and Valeria described everything, including the massive number of enemies and the dark ritual platform, and the shocking presence of humans among the cult members. The human's face grew pale as she listened, and she said this was worse than she had feared, because if humans from her world were involved, then the portal that brought her here might have also brought others with less peaceful intentions. Valeria had not considered that possibility, but it made terrible sense, and she asked Maya if she thought these humans came from Earth or from somewhere else, and Maya admitted she did not know for certain. They talked late into the night about possible strategies and defenses, and Maya shared knowledge from her world about tactics and fortifications that might help against the cult's superior numbers. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them both, and Maya fell asleep in the chair beside Valeria's bed, still holding her hand. And Valeria did not have the heart to wake her and send her to the guest quarters. The next morning, Valeria woke to find sunlight streaming through her windows, and Maya was still there asleep in an awkward position that would definitely give her a sore neck when she woke up. Ember had somehow found his way into the room during the night, and he was curled up on Maya's lap, also sleeping peacefully, and the scene was so domestic and sweet that Valeria felt warmth spreading through her chest. She carefully got out of bed, trying not to disturb them, and went to her balcony to think about everything they had learned and what it meant for the future of her people. The shadow cult was much stronger than anyone had realized, and they were preparing some kind of massive ritual that would likely unleash horrors beyond imagination, and the elves did not have the numbers or power to stop them alone. But maybe they did not have to fight alone, because Maya had proven that some humans could be trusted and allied with, and if they could find more humans who opposed the cult, then they might have a chance. Valeria heard movement behind her and turned to see Maya stretching and rubbing her neck with a grimace. And Ember was awake too and chirping happily. While bouncing around the room, Maya came to stand beside her on the balcony, and they looked out over the beautiful landscape together, and the human said that whatever happened next, they would face it together, because that was what friends did. Word friends hit Valeria harder than she expected, because she had not had a real friend in centuries, and her position as Empress made it difficult to form genuine connections with other elves who always saw her as their ruler. First, she turned to Maya and asked if she really meant that, and if she was willing to risk her life fighting in a war that was not hers, and the human nodded without hesitation and said that Ember had become family, and you protect family, no matter what. Valeria felt tears forming in her eyes, and she quickly blinked them away, but Maya saw them anyway, and pulled her into a hug, and the Empress allowed herself to lean into that embrace and accept the comfort being offered. They stood there for a long moment, just holding each other, while Ember chirped encouragingly and played with the hem of Maya's shirt, And somewhere in that quiet morning peace, they both knew that everything had changed. The battle ahead would be difficult and dangerous, and many would likely die before it was over. But at least they would not face it alone, and sometimes having one person believe in you was enough to make all the difference. 3 days had passed since the night reconnaissance mission, and the entire palace was preparing for the inevitable attack from the Shadow Cult, and everyone worked day and night strengthening defenses and gathering supplies. Maya had become an invaluable member of the War Council, and her ideas from Earth military strategy had helped them create better fortifications around the palace, including trenches and barriers that would slow down any ground. Assault Valeria watched her friend work, tirelessly organizing medical supplies and training volunteers in basic first aid techniques, and the human never complained about being tired, even though she barely slept more than a few hours each night. Ember followed Maya everywhere like a devoted shadow, and he had grown noticeably larger over the past few days, and his golden scales gleamed brighter, and he could now breathe small spurts of flame when he got excited. The little dragon had bonded deeply with Maya, and whenever she sat down to rest, he would curl up in her lap and purr like a giant cat, and Valeria found herself feeling a tiny bit jealous of their connection. But that jealousy faded when Maya looked up and smiled at her with those warm brown eyes and gestured for Valeria to join them, and the three of them spent peaceful moments together that felt like stolen treasures in the midst of chaos. On the 4th day, scouts reported that the Shadow Cult had begun moving toward the palace, and they would likely arrive within 2 days, and the entire army was marching, which meant this would be the final confrontation. Valeria called an emergency council meeting, and all her advisors and military leaders gathered in the war room with grim expressions because everyone knew the odds were heavily against them. Kieran presented the latest intelligence report showing that the cult had at least 300 fighters, plus various summoned creatures and dark magic users, while the palace had only 80 trained warriors and 20 guards. Maya listened carefully, and then asked a question that nobody had considered, which was whether there were any nearby human villages that might be willing to help if they knew the cult was threatening everyone. Valeria explained that relations between elves and humans had been tense for generations, and most villages would probably celebrate if the Shadow Cult destroyed the palace rather than offering assistance. But Maya argued that ordinary people usually did not support evil cults no matter what race they belonged to, and maybe it was worth trying to reach out and ask for help, because the worst they could do was say no. The council members looked skeptical, but Valeria found herself agreeing with Maya, because desperate times called for desperate measures, and pride was worthless if everyone died without even trying to seek allies. She decided to send Kieran with a message to the 3 nearest human villages, explaining the danger and asking if they would be willing to unite against the common enemy that threatened all life in the realm. Maya volunteered to go with Kieran because she was human and might be able to convince the villagers more effectively than an elf warrior who they might see as threatening or untrustworthy. Valeria did not want to send Maya into potential danger, but she recognized the wisdom of the suggestion and reluctantly agreed, as long as Thunder accompanied them for protection and quick escape if needed. That afternoon, Maya and Kieran left on their diplomatic mission while Valeria stayed behind to continue preparations, and she watched them fly away on Thunder's back with anxiety twisting her stomach into knots. Ember sensed her distress and nuzzled against her leg, making comforting chirping sounds, and Valeria picked him up and held him close and whispered that she hoped Maya would return safely. The hours crawled by slowly, and Valeria found herself unable to focus on anything productive, and she kept walking to the courtyard to scan the sky for any sign of Thunder's distinctive red scales. Finally, as the sun was setting, she saw them returning, and relief flooded through her entire body, and she ran out to meet them as they landed, and Maya slid off Thunder's back with a huge grin on her face. The human excitedly reported that all 3 villages had agreed to help, and they were sending their best fighters to the palace, and in total, they would have about 60 additional warriors, which significantly improved their odds. Kieran added that the villagers had been shocked to learn about the Shadow Cult's plans, and many of them had lost family members to mysterious disappearances that they now realized were cult activities. The village leaders wanted revenge and justice, and they saw this battle as an opportunity to strike back against the enemy that had been terrorizing them for years, without them even knowing who was responsible. Valeria felt hope blooming in her chest for the first time in days, and she thanked Maya for her brilliant idea and for her courage in reaching out to former enemies and building bridges that had been burned long ago. That evening, the first group of human warriors arrived at the palace, and there was tension in the air as elves and humans regarded each other with suspicion and uncertainty after generations of mistrust. But Maya stepped forward and gave a speech about how their races were stronger together than apart, and how the shadow cult wanted them to remain divided and weak, and by uniting they were already winning. Her words resonated with both groups, and slowly, the tension began to ease and elves and humans started talking to each other and sharing stories and finding common ground. Valeria realized that Maya was a natural leader and diplomat, and she had accomplished in one evening what might have taken years of careful negotiations under normal circumstances. The next day, more human warriors arrived, and the palace became a hive of activity as everyone trained together and learned each other's fighting styles and developed coordinated tactics. Ember played with the children from the human villages who had come with their parents, and his playful antics brought laughter and joy to people who had been living in fear for so long. On the morning of the 5th day, the Shadow Cult army appeared on the horizon, and they marched in organized formations with dark banners flapping in the wind, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Valeria stood on the palace walls with Maya beside her, and they watched the enemy approach, and the Empress felt fear trying to claw its way up her throat. But she pushed it down. Maya reached over and took her hand and squeezed it gently, and said that no matter what happened today, they had already achieved something incredible by bringing their people together. The Shadow Cult stopped just outside arrow range, and a figure stepped forward from their ranks, and it was a tall man in elaborate robes covered in glowing symbols, and his voice boomed across the field. He demanded that Valeria surrender the palace and all the dragons immediately, and if she complied, he would allow everyone to leave with their lives. But if she refused, they would all be destroyed. Valeria stepped forward, and her voice rang out clear and strong as she told him that the High Elves would never surrender to darkness, and they would fight to their last breath to protect this realm. The cult leader laughed and said she was a fool to throw away so many lives for pride, and he raised his hand and gave the signal to attack. The battle erupted with the sound of war cries and clashing steel, and Valeria leaped onto Storm's back while Thunder carried Maya, who had insisted on fighting despite having no real combat training. Ember stayed in the palace as ordered, though he cried miserably at being left behind, and the older dragons flew into battle, breathing fire down on the enemy forces, while arrows flew in both directions. The fighting was fierce and brutal, and both sides took heavy casualties, but the combined elf and human forces fought with courage and determination that the cult had not expected. Maya proved herself surprisingly effective in aerial combat by using a bow that the elves had given her, and her medical knowledge helped her identify weak points on the summoned creatures that made them easier to kill. Hours passed and the battle raged on, and Valeria was exhausted and wounded, but she kept fighting because giving up was not an option and her people needed her strength. Then something extraordinary happened, because Ember appeared on the battlefield, despite being told to stay behind, and his scales were glowing with brilliant golden light, and ancient symbols covered his body. The little dragon had grown to full size in mere moments, and he roared with a voice that shook the earth, and divine fire poured from his mouth, incinerating dozens of cult members instantly. Valeria realized that the prophecy her grandmother told her about was coming true, right before her eyes, and Maya was the guardian from beyond the stars, and Ember was the vessel of ancient power. Together, the three of them fought like a legendary force, and the tide of battle turned decisively in their favor, and the Shadow Cult began to retreat in disarray and fear. When the dust finally settled, the cult leader lay defeated and his army was scattered, and the threat to the realm had been eliminated. Though at a cost of many brave warriors who gave their lives, Valeria stood among the survivors, both elf and human, and she proclaimed that from this day forward, their races would be united as one people, and they would build a future together based on friendship and trust. Maya hugged her tightly and Ember nuzzled them both, and in that moment Valeria knew that finding the human protecting her lost cub had been the beginning of something far greater than she ever imagined.